Hi friends, this is Caitlin and today I'm sharing with you a card that I made as part of the My Favorite Things Camp Create Background Bonanza. So my background was inspired by this new fun plaid pattern, and I decided to take out my ink swatches and pick out what cubes I thought lined up with the colors best. All the colors that I ended up using and the rest of the supplies will all be listed in the description box below. I decided to use this large stripy background stamp to do some heat embossing for my main panel. So you can see here I'm using my Misti and I am placing the cling stamp in the bottom of the Misti, and I'm going to use some double-sided tape that I touch a little bit to take off some of the tackiness to stick my paper to the door of the Misti. I'm borrowing this tip from Kathy Zilski and it's literally a game changer. Using the Misti also allowed me to stamp my image twice, which really helped me get a very clear impression. The hand-drawn feeling of this stamp is really what made me fall in love with it to begin with, and so I really wanted to keep that detail. I'm coating my stamped image with a detail white embossing powder, and I made sure to place an extra piece of printer paper underneath before I started for an easier cleanup. After ensuring that all of the embossing powder was melted with my heat tool, it was time to start creating my ink blended gradient. Now I'm generally more comfortable ink blending with foam, but I have found that with the new formulation of the My Favorite Things ink cubes that I get a much easier blend and a smoother transition when I'm using a blending brush. I'm just working my way from the top all the way down to the bottom with the same brush since I'm in the same color family, working from lightest down to darkest. You'll see in a second that I do end up going back up the gradient, starting with the darkest at the bottom up to the light, just to focus on the saturation of color and to make sure that I get as smooth a transition as possible on either side of the color blend. Please keep in mind that this video has been sped up so much. I think my original video length was something like 40 or 50 minutes, so breaking it down into an 8-minute video means that this is not how I blend in real life. Once the ink blend was done, I gently wiped over the embossed lines with my stamp Shammy just to take off any of the excess ink off the top, and you can see it really helps those white lines to pop. After trimming down my panel with a double stitch rectangle die, I decided to prep a small scrap piece of white paper with the darkest ink that I had used in my color blend. I wanted to do a white heat emboss sentiment, and I didn't have any navy that was a matching color, so I decided to make my own. But I wanted to give myself plenty of time for the ink to dry so that when I go to heat emboss, my anti-static powder will actually do its job. So while that ink was drying, I decided to get some Copic coloring done, and I pulled some simple images from the Birdie Brown Hog Heaven stamp set. I really wanted to try to keep this as simple and clean as possible to help keep the focus on that pretty background we just spent all that time making. For both of my images, I decided to stick with a 3-color Copic blend, and you can see here I'm starting out with my darkest shade and working my way lighter. When I first started Copic coloring, I would usually go in with my lightest shade to mark out my shadows, but because this isn't really a scene and it's just these 2 images, I don't really have a specific light source in mind, so I figured I would just go for it. I used the darkest shade towards the outside of the pig's face, and I'm just working my way in lighter as I go up. I figured if anything, the sun's higher up in the sky, and so the bottom part of his arms and his chin would have more shading, but besides that, I really didn't overthink it. Pigs are some of my favorite images to color, and I really do love this color combination of R20, R01, and R00. I think it really has a perfect piggy pink. When I was picking out the colors for the fence, I decided to go with my E40s. I really didn't want anything that was too orange that would create too much contrast with all the blue and green background we were making. I wanted it to not be monochromatic, but not pop over the top either. I decided to keep all my shading towards the right-hand side of each panel of the fence and along the bottom part of each of those brackets all the way across. Started out with my darkest color again with the E47 and then went in with my E44, just blending and feathering out those marks, making sure to leave myself a little room for a highlight on each panel. I really didn't want the grass at the bottom to feel like it was touching that lower bracket, and that space can be a little bit tricky because it is kind of small. I also blended out under the brackets, and I ended up going over the bottom half of each bracket with that medium middle color. Then I went in with my E43 to fill in all of the spaces that were left, really trying to take my time to go over the edge of that medium to the lightest shade to really blend out so you get that smooth transition. I had a little bit of an internal debate when it came time to decide what I was going to do with that grass. I don't even think I have half of the Copic markers available, so all of the green markers I do have are very green, and I just felt it was going to contrast too much with the background, so I decided to leave it white. Now you can see I'm taking my die cuts, lining them up, putting a little bit of washi tape to hold them in place, and I'm going to go ahead and cut those out off screen. Next, it was time to get my sentiment strip ready, and so I took out my itty bitty basic sentiment set, and I decided to go with the hello there, like this little cheeky pig is just hanging over the fence like, hey, what's up? And so I used my anti-static powder tool this time, thank goodness, and a fan brush just to wipe off the excess, just in case that ink hadn't fully dried on my blended cardstock. Because I was going to be doing a white heat emboss on such a dark background, I actually decided to go in with some white pigment ink. This one's from Simon Says Stamp. But I find that the white ink helps to make sure that if I miss any little spots of embossing powder, that the white ink will show through and I end up with a more crisp line to my tiny, tiny letters. Speaking of how tiny these itty bitty sentiments are, I also have the coordinating dies, and these are really a lifesaver because I normally just use a guillotine trimmer and they're very hard to cut out on their own because they're so small, but I love them so much. I also used a white gel pen just to tap a little ink into a few spots that I felt weren't quite bright enough on that sentiment. Then it was time to adhere my heat emboss panel to my plaid background panel, which is cut out to an A2 size standard card of 5.5 by 4.25. And I also use my pen, you'll see I use my pen a lot to go in and clean up any little edges of marker that got out or anything like that. I adhered my fence panel flat to the heat emboss background, and I decided to pop up my pig and my sentiment strip with just a teeny tiny bit of this really thin 3M foam. So it had a little dimension, but it would still be easy to ship. I really loved how clean and simple this card was turning out, but clean and simple is definitely not my strong suit, and so I decided that it needed a little bit of sparkle. So I pulled out this sequin mix from the Pawsome stamp company, I love them, and I grabbed out of there a few of these little flat iridescent pieces, confetti pieces that were in the mix. And I grabbed them, and you can see I'm just popping them in kind of a diagonal line. I went with 5 because odd numbers are generally more pleasing to the eye, and I thought it just complemented the whole thing really well. The Camp Create Challenge by My Favorite Things is running until August 11th, so you have time to check it out if you haven't already. I'm so excited to be sharing this card with you and the first of many videos to come. If you enjoyed what I did, please click the subscribe button below and leave me a thumbs up. Also, if you have any feedback or questions for me, feel free to leave a comment. Thank you so much. Have a great day and happy crafting.